She had smiled at every family dinner, every Sunday service, every birthday, for 60 years. Nobody knew. Not her husband, not her sister, not her son. She had trained herself so completely in the art of the surface that even she had sometimes forgotten what lived beneath it. But now she was 82, and Thomas was gone, and the magnolia tree was blooming again outside the window, and across a restaurant table in Atlanta, a 61-year-old woman with her father's eyes was waiting to finally hear her mother's voice say her name. What do you do when the truth you've buried is the only thing that can set someone else free? What do you say to the daughter you gave away before she could ever know you? And how do you look in the mirror of 60 years of silence and decide that today, finally, is the day you stop? The magnolia tree in the backyard had been there longer than Eleanor May Hargrove herself. She knew this because her mother had told her so, back when her mother still told her things worth knowing. It stood at the far edge of the property now, thick and ancient, its white blossoms catching the late April light in a way that made Ellie's chest ache with something she could no longer name. Grief, maybe. Or the particular loneliness that comes from carrying a story too long without ever telling it to anyone. She was 82 years old. Her knees told her so every morning. Her hands, spotted and slow, confirmed it every time she reached for a coffee mug or tried to button her cardigan without help. But her mind was as sharp and as unforgiving as it had ever been. That was both her blessing and her burden. She forgot where she put her reading glasses. She never forgot a single day of 1963. The house was full today. Her sister Margaret, Maggie, always, Maggie, even now at 78, had driven up from Brunswick with her daughter Carol and Carol's 3 children, 2 of whom were old enough to look at their phones through the entirety of Sunday dinner without anyone saying a word about it. Ellie's son from her marriage to Thomas, Robert, had come with his wife, Denise, bringing along a casserole that Ellie already knew she would pick at without appetite. And there were neighbors, a few from the Baptist church on Oleander Street, women who had known Ellie for 40 years and thought they knew everything about her. They were gathered, all of them, because Thomas had been gone for 6 months now. 61 years of marriage. The casseroles had mostly stopped coming, and the phone calls had grown less frequent, and the world had quietly resumed its turning without asking Eleanor May Hargrove for permission. Grief, she had come to understand, has a shelf life that is always shorter than the grief itself. She sat at the head of the long dining room table, Thomas's chair. She still could not think of it as anything else, and watched the people she loved move around her kitchen. Carol was refilling the sweet tea. Robert was laughing too loud at something the neighbor men were saying near the back door, the way he always laughed when he was nervous about something he couldn't name. Maggie was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting the pound cake into even slices with the precision of a woman who needed something to do with her hands. Maggie had their mother's hands. Ellie had noticed this for 50 years and never said it out loud. It was looking at Maggie's hands, at the careful, deliberate way she pressed the knife through the dense yellow cake, that something shifted inside Eleanor May Hargrove. Something that had been calcifying slowly for 6 decades suddenly cracked open, the way old wood cracks in the first cold snap of November. Not violently, just finally. I am 82 years old, she thought, and the thought arrived not with panic, but with a strange, clarifying calm. Thomas is gone. Mama is long gone. James is gone. There is no one left to protect, and no one left to hurt, except myself. And I have been hurting myself for 60 years. She set down her sweet tea glass very carefully. I need to say something, she said. Her voice was not loud. It never had been. But it carried the particular authorities of a woman who had spent a lifetime choosing her silences, and the room understood this without knowing why. The conversations died one by one, like candles snuffed in sequence. The young men near the back door stopped laughing. Even the two teenagers looked up from their phones, drawn by something in the quality of the quiet. Maggie turned from the counter. Her eyes found Ellie's across the kitchen, and something passed between them. A flicker, quick as a sparrow, that told Ellie her sister had been waiting for this moment too. Maybe not consciously, maybe not willingly, but waiting nonetheless. "I've been keeping a secret," Ellie said, "for a long time. Most of my life, if I'm honest about it. And I've decided that I am too old and too tired to keep it any longer." Robert took a step toward her. "Let me speak, baby." She said it gently but without apology. "Please, just let me speak." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. Outside, through the dining room window, she could see the magnolia tree moving slowly in the afternoon breeze, its white blossoms trembling, like something that had been trying to say something for years. She thought about where to begin. You always have to choose where to begin. Every story has 100 possible starting points, and the one you choose says something about what you believe the story is really about. She chose 1960. She chose a summer evening. She chose a boy with serious eyes, standing at the edge of a tobacco field at dusk, the Georgia sky going orange and purple behind him, and the whole impossible weight of what they were about to become to each other, just beginning to gather on the horizon, like weather. "There was a man," she said. "Before your father. Before any of this." She paused, took a breath that was 60 years deep. "His name was James. The summer of 1960 in Millhaven, Georgia moved slowly, the way all southern summers do, thick and honeyed and inescapable, the air itself seeming to press down on you like a warm hand. Eleanor May Hargrove was 18 years old, recently graduated from Millhaven High School, and possessed of the particular restlessness that comes from being intelligent in a place that has few uses for female intelligence. She helped her mother with the house. She sang in the church choir on Sundays. She read library books that she hid under her mattress because her mother considered novels a waste of time that could be spent in more productive spiritual reflection. Her father, Harold Hargrove, owned a modest dry goods store on the town's main street and leased farmland on the eastern edge of the county to several families, black families mostly, who sharecropped tobacco and corn and soybeans under arrangements that Harold considered fair and that his tenants considered better than some but not as good as others. Harold was not a cruel man. He was simply a man of his time and place, which meant that he moved through a world organized by rules he had never chosen and never particularly questioned. It was through her father's store that Ellie first encountered James Whitfield. He came in on a Tuesday morning in early June to pay his family's monthly account. His father, Arthur Whitfield, was one of Harold's tenants, and Ellie was behind the counter because the girl who usually worked mornings had called in sick. James was 20 years old. He was tall and lean, with careful hands, and the kind of eyes that seemed to be thinking about 3 things at once, while still paying complete attention to the thing directly in front of them. He counted out the bills, slowly, and set them on the counter with a quiet dignity that Ellie noticed without knowing yet what she was noticing. "Whitfield account," he said, "for June." "I see it," Ellie said. She wrote it in the ledger. She did not look up immediately when she finished, and neither did he leave immediately when she was done, and the silence between those 2 moments stretched for just a beat longer than was strictly necessary. It was nothing. It was everything. She would not see him again for 3 weeks. She thought about him for all 3 of those weeks in the distracted, half-guilty way you think about something you know you are not supposed to want. When he came back into the store in late June, his father had sent him for nails and lamp oil. Ellie was behind the counter again, and when their eyes met this time, she understood that the 3 weeks had not felt short to him either. They spoke carefully, about small things, the weather, which had been brutal even by Georgia standards, the new Chevrolet that the hardware store owner had just acquired and that everyone in town had an opinion about. Books. She mentioned she had just finished a novel, and his face changed in a way that surprised her. He asked what novel. She told him. He had read it too. This was not supposed to happen. Not in Millhaven, Georgia, in the summer of 1960. Not between a white girl from a respectable family and a young black man who leased land from her father. The rules were not written anywhere that Ellie could point to, but they were as real and as solid as the red clay ground under their feet. They were enforced not primarily by law, though law was certainly part of it, but by something deeper and more pervasive, by the weight of every eye in a small town, by the knowledge of what happened to people who forgot themselves. James knew this better than Ellie did. He understood it in a way that lived in his body, and not just his mind. The habitual alertness, the careful calibration of every interaction with white people, the narrow margin for error that his father had explained to him in so many different ways over so many years that it had become part of how he breathed. And yet there was the river. The Ogeechee River ran through the eastern edge of the county, through stands of cypress and tupelo, and through long stretches of flat bottomland that most people had little reason to visit. James fished there on Sunday evenings after church. Ellie had walked there since childhood, following the path through the woods behind the Hargrove property that wound down to a bend in the river, where the water ran clear and cool over smooth stones. They did not plan to meet there. They planned nothing. The first time it happened, early July, a Sunday evening so hot the air itself seemed to shimmer. It was genuine accident. The second time, 3 weeks later, it was something they could no longer call accident, but were not yet ready to call anything else. By September, it was love. Not the reckless, theatrical love of people who don't understand what they're risking. Something quieter and more fundamental than that. The love of two people who had found in each other a place where they could put down, at least for a few hours, the performance of being who the world needed them to be. With James, Ellie could be intelligent without apology. She could disagree and be taken seriously. She could say what she thought about God and politics and the future she wanted, and he would push back and question and engage in a way that made her feel, for the first time in her life, genuinely and completely seen. For James, Ellie was the first person outside his family who had ever read the same books he read, who had asked him what he thought about something, and then actually waited for his answer. He was a careful man. His circumstances required careful men. But with Ellie, by the river, in the long blue evenings when the fireflies began, he allowed himself a carelessness that felt as precious as anything he had ever known. They never touched in public. They were never seen together in town. They built their world in the margins, the river bend, the edge of the tobacco field at dusk, brief and coded exchanges across the counter of her father's store. It was a world the size of a secret, and they filled it as completely as they could. By the winter of 1961, Ellie knew that what she felt for James Whitfield was the central fact of her life. She also knew, with the terrible lucidity that comes from loving something you cannot keep, that the world they lived in would not allow this fact to survive. She was right, but she did not yet know the full cost of what being right would require. In the spring of 1962, two things happened that changed the architecture of Eleanor May Hargrove's life in ways she would spend the next 60 years navigating. The first thing was a letter. It came from a woman named Cecilia Beaumont, who lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and who signed herself as a distant cousin of Ellie's mother, Ruth. Ellie would not have known about the letter at all, except that she was the one who collected the mail that Thursday morning in March, and the envelope had Cecilia Beaumont's return address written in an unfamiliar hand, and something about the combination of her mother's name and the word cousin in a letter from Charleston made Ellie's fingers hesitate. She did not open it. She was not that kind of girl. But she set it on the kitchen table and watched her mother's face when Ruth came in from hanging laundry and saw it lying there. And that face told her everything she needed to know. That the letter was not entirely a surprise, that it was not entirely welcome, and that whatever it said, her mother intended for its contents to remain exactly where they were, buried. Ruth snatched the letter up and took it to her bedroom. She did not come out for an hour. When she did, she said nothing about it, and the silence she imposed on the subject was so total and so practiced that Ellie understood it was not a new silence. It was a silence Ruth had been maintaining for a very long time. Ellie wrote back to Cecilia Beaumont herself, 2 weeks later, from the library in town where she sometimes went to read in peace. She was not sure what she expected. What she received 6 weeks after that was a letter that rearranged the foundations of everything she had believed about herself. Cecilia Beaumont was 81 years old and dying of a heart condition, and she had decided that some truths were too heavy to take into the grave. She wrote to Ellie because Ruth had refused to answer her letters for 20 years, and because she felt that at least someone in the family should know the truth. The truth was this: Ruth Hargrove's mother, Ellie's maternal grandmother, a woman named Ida, who had died before Ellie was born, and who existed in family memory only as a sepia photograph of a very light-skinned woman in a white dress, had been a black woman. Born in coastal Georgia to a mixed-race family, Ida had spent her adult life passing as white with a thoroughness and success that had required her to sever every tie to the family she came from, to disavow the community she had grown up in, and to never once, not in 40 years of marriage to a white man, allow herself to be seen as anything other than what she had decided to become. Ruth knew. She had always known. She had inherited not just Ida's light skin and her silence, but her determination that the truth would stop with her, that her daughters would live in the world as white women because she had fought too hard for that ground to surrender it. And Ellie, who was now sitting in the Millhaven Public Library, with a letter shaking in her hands, understood several things at once with a clarity that felt like cold water poured over her from a great height. She understood that she was not who she had believed herself to be, not entirely, not in the way this world drew its lines. She understood that her mother had kept this from her, not from malice, but from a terrified and ferocious love. The love of a woman who had watched her own mother disappear into a lie, and who had chosen to go further into that lie rather than out of it, because the alternative, in rural Georgia in the 1940s and 1950s, was unthinkable. And she understood, with a vertigo that made the library walls seem to tilt, that she, Eleanor May Hargrove, white girl from a respectable family, daughter of Harold and Ruth, had spent the last 2 years in love with a black man, not despite being who she was, but in some way she could not yet articulate, because of it, as if something in her blood had been trying to find its way home. She did not tell James about the letter. Not yet. She needed to hold it herself first, to turn it over and examine it from every side, to figure out what it meant for who she was and who she was going to be. The second thing that happened in the spring of 1962 was this. She realized she was pregnant. She was 20 years old. She was 3 weeks along, and she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with medical confirmation, she would not see a doctor for another month, that the child was James's. There had been no one else. There had never been anyone else. For 2 weeks she lived in a private terror so complete that she functioned through each day like a person moving through deep water. She cooked breakfast. She sang in the choir. She answered questions about her health with steady, practiced smiles, and inside the warm and lightless place where she kept the things she could not say, she turned over the terrible arithmetic of her situation. She was the daughter of Harold Hargrove. She was carrying the child of a black man in Georgia in 1962. Her mother, who had spent her life building a wall of silence around a truth that could have destroyed everything, would consider this not just a personal catastrophe, but an existential threat. She told James on a Sunday evening in May, at the river bend where they had first stopped pretending their meetings were accidental. She watched his face move through shock and fear, and something that might have been wonder if wonder had been something they could afford. "We have to go," he said when he could speak. "We have to leave. There are places, North, Chicago, Detroit, where people live differently, where this doesn't have to be." "James," she stopped him. Not because she didn't want to believe him, because she was afraid of how much she did. "I need to think. I need time. Just give me a little time." She did not have as much time as she thought. Her mother noticed what mothers notice. A week later, Ruth Hargrove came into Ellie's bedroom on a Tuesday evening, closed the door behind her, sat down on the edge of the bed, and asked the question she had already answered for herself. The conversation that followed was the longest hour of Eleanor May Hargrove's life. It was also the hour in which she lost most of what mattered to her. Ruth Hargrove was not a monster. This is the thing that made it worse. Monsters are easy to refuse. Ruth was a frightened woman who loved her daughter the only way she knew how to love anything. Fiercely, protectively, and without reference to what the person being loved actually wanted. She sat on the edge of the bed and she did not shout and she did not cry. Not that night. She spoke in the quiet, measured voice of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation in some part of herself for years. Not because she had known it would happen, but because Ruth Hargrove had spent her whole life preparing for catastrophes that the truth might bring. "Do you understand?" she said. "What will happen to him if anyone finds out?" Ellie understood. She was 20 years old and she was not naive. She had grown up in Georgia in the 1950s. She knew what happened to black men who were accused of relationships with white women. She had heard the names. Emmett Till had been murdered in Mississippi only 7 years ago. She was not naive. "And do you understand?" Ruth continued. "What will happen to you?" "I don't care what happens to me." "Well, I care." Her mother's voice did not waver. "I have cared about what happens to you since before you were born, Eleanor. And I am telling you that there is only one way through this that keeps everyone alive." There was a family, the Mercer family in Atlanta, who had been unable to have children of their own. Ruth had a connection through the church. Everything could be arranged quietly, through channels that asked few questions and kept careful secrets. The baby would be born in Atlanta, placed with the Mercers, and the matter would be concluded without Millhaven ever knowing it had happened. Ellie would tell people she'd gone to care for a sick relative. She would come home. She would marry Thomas Hargrove, Harold's second cousin's son, a decent and steady man who had already expressed interest, and she would build a life that was safe and real and sustainable. "And James?" Ellie asked. "James needs to never know," Ruth said. "He needs to be protected from knowing. If he knows, he might do something that gets him killed. That is not the life you want on your conscience." It was a terrible logic, the most suffocating kind, the kind that is partly right. Ellie fought it for 3 days. She cried herself hollow in the bathroom, with the tap running so no one could hear. She wrote a letter to James that she never sent. She thought about Chicago, about Detroit, about the terrifying and luminous possibility that James had described at the river. A different life, a different world, a place where they might be simply 2 people who loved each other. And then she thought about what Ruth had said. He might do something that gets him killed. She thought about James's face, his careful face, the face of a man who had spent his whole life calculating risk. She thought about what his father had told him, about the narrow margin for error. And she thought about what it would mean for James, proud, careful, serious James, to know that the woman he loved was carrying his child and had decided not to tell him. She thought about what it would mean for him to try to come to her, to claim her, to do the thing that love demands. She thought about Georgia in 1962. She broke on the third day, not gracefully, not with acceptance. But she broke. She did not tell James she was pregnant. She could not find words that would not put him in danger. And in the end, she chose his life over his knowing. She told him instead, on a Sunday at the river that would be their last Sunday, that she could not continue, that she was going to marry Thomas, that she was sorry. She watched his face go through something she could not bear to watch and could not look away from. He was too careful and too proud to beg. He asked her once quietly if this was what she truly wanted. She said yes. The word cost her everything she had. She went to Atlanta in October. The baby was born in December 1962. A girl, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Ellie held her for 4 hours before the Mercers arrived. She named her in her own heart, in the private language of her grief, Clara. She kissed the baby's forehead and told her the one true thing she had left to give. I love you. I am doing this because I love you. I hope someday the world is different enough that you can know who you came from. She came back to Millhaven in January 1963. She married Thomas Hargrove in March. He was a kind man. He loved her steadily and without complication, and she was grateful for him in the way you are grateful for solid ground after a long time at sea. She built the life her mother had described. She sang in the choir. She raised Robert. She tended the house and the magnolia tree and the long accumulation of ordinary days. And she kept the secret. Every single day for 60 years she kept the secret. She kept it when the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, when the world she had lived in began, slowly, incompletely, agonizingly, to change. She kept it when Maggie married and had children, and Ruth grew old and sharp and then old and soft, and finally gone. She kept it when Thomas died, and the house grew quiet, and the reasons for keeping the secret became harder and harder to name clearly. She kept it because she had kept it so long that breaking it seemed impossible. She kept it because she did not know if Clara had survived, if she was loved, if she had built a good life. She kept it because she was afraid of what she would find, and equally afraid of what she would not find. She kept it until she was 82 years old, and sitting at the head of a dining room table with a magnolia tree moving in the window behind her, and the weight of the secret so much heavier than her body that she finally put it down. The room was very quiet when Ellie finished speaking. She had not told them everything at once. That was not how it came out. It came out in the way these things do when they have been compressed for 60 years, in surges and pauses, in moments where her voice held steady and moments where it did not, in answers to questions that Robert and Maggie and Carol asked, sometimes gently, and sometimes with the stunned bluntness of people who have just discovered that the ground beneath their feet is not what they believed it to be. Maggie cried. She cried in a way that was not only about grief, but about recognition, because there had always been a distance in Ruth that she had never been able to explain, a place in their mother that none of them had ever been allowed to reach, and now she understood at least the shape of what had been living there. Robert did not cry, not in front of her, but when he hugged her, and he hugged her the way he hadn't since he was a small boy, his arms tight and his face pressed against the top of her head. She could feel the way he was working to hold himself together, and she loved him so much in that moment that it was almost unbearable. The teenagers put their phones away. Ellie noticed this, and it meant more to her than she would have expected. There were difficult questions. Robert wanted to know if she had ever tried to find Clara, and the answer, that she had been afraid to try, that she had carried the fear of finding nothing alongside the fear of finding something, was a painful one to give. Carol asked about James, and Ellie told her that she had learned, through a brief inquiry she had made in the 1980s, that James Whitfield had eventually gone north as he had planned, to Chicago, where he had married, had children, worked as a school teacher, and died in 1997 at the age of 57, of a heart attack. She had received this information from a woman who had known his family, and she had sat with it for a week, and she had cried for him with the concentrated grief of all the years she had not allowed herself to cry. "He had a good life," she said. "A real life. I have to believe that." Maggie asked about their grandmother, about Ida, about the letter from Cecilia Beaumont that Ellie had never told anyone about, the letter that had told her who they really were. "You've known this whole time," Maggie said. "It was not an accusation. It was wonder." "Since I was 20 years old," Ellie said. "Mama was so afraid. I understood it, even though I was angry for a long time. She thought she was protecting us. She thought passing was the only way to be safe, and she wasn't entirely wrong, not in the world she grew up in." "But it cost everything," Maggie said. "It cost everything," Ellie agreed. There was a silence that was different from the earlier silences, less like shock and more like people adjusting to new weight, redistributing what they carried, finding a new way to stand. It was Carol's oldest son, a 23-year-old named Daniel, who had been silent throughout all of it, who said the thing that moved the conversation into its final. He had been listening from the corner with the attentiveness of someone much older than his years, and when he spoke, his voice was careful. "Did you ever try to find her? Clara?" Ellie looked at him, at his young face, open and serious. She thought about what it would mean to have an answer to this question that was not simply, "No, I was afraid." "I did something," she said slowly. "About 2 years ago, Robert's daughter, my granddaughter, Keisha, she convinced me to do one of those DNA tests. She said everybody was doing them. It was just for fun, to learn about where you come from." A small, complicated smile. "I didn't tell her why I was really interested. I just did it." The room shifted. "And?" Robert said. Ellie reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She had carried the printed email there for 3 days, folded into a small square, because she had not known how to begin, and had needed it close to her, while she figured out how. She unfolded it now and smoothed it on the table in front of her. "A man named David Mercer contacted me through the testing website 7 months ago," she said. "He is 35 years old. He lives in Atlanta. He said that the DNA results showed I was his grandmother, that his mother, a woman named Clara Mercer, had always known she was adopted, had spent years trying to find her biological family, and had come close several times, but never close enough." She paused, pressed her fingers flat against the paper. "He said his mother was 61 years old and in good health, and that she had a daughter of her own, a girl named Josephine, who is 16, and that if I was willing, she would very much like to speak with me." The silence that followed this was the deepest yet. "Ellie," Maggie whispered, "why didn't you tell us?" "Because I didn't know if I deserved to," Ellie said, and the simplicity and honesty of it seemed to surprise even her. "I gave her away, Maggie. I gave my daughter away, and I never came looking. I didn't know if having her want to find me meant that I had the right to want to be found." "Did you write back?" Robert asked. His voice was very careful. "I did," Ellie said. 3 weeks ago. I wrote to David and I told him yes. I told him I had been waiting 60 years to say what needed to be said to his mother, and that I understood if she wasn't ready, or if she was angry, or if she had decided she didn't need anything from me anymore. I told him that I would not ask for more than she was willing to give. She looked around the room, at Maggie's wet face, at Robert's tightly controlled expression, at the teenagers who were leaning forward now, with the unself-conscious hunger of young people encountering real life for what might be the first time. "Last Monday," she said, "David called me. Clara wants to meet me." The room came apart a little then, in the good way, the way rooms come apart when something that has been held very tightly is at last released. Maggie covered her mouth with her hand. Robert made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. Even one of the teenagers, the older girl, whose name was Brianna, pressed both hands flat over her heart in a gesture so involuntary and so human that Ellie felt something in her chest loosen with gratitude. "When?" Carol asked. 2 weeks from Saturday," Ellie said. "In Atlanta. David is going to bring her to a restaurant he knows. And I am going to go, and I am going to look my daughter in the face for the first time since she was 4 hours old. And I am going to tell her the truth." She paused. "The whole truth. All of it. Her father's name, what kind of man he was, what he deserved to know and never knew, who her great-great-grandmother was, where she comes from. All of it." "Are you scared?" Brianna asked. 14 years old, phone forgotten on the table beside her. Just a girl asking the real question. Ellie thought about it for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give a true one. "Terrified," she said. "But I have been carrying this by myself for 60 years. Being scared by yourself is different from being scared with people who love you standing nearby." She looked at Robert, at Maggie, at the room full of people who were still, despite everything, her family. "I thought about not telling you all today. I thought about waiting until after I'd seen her, but I realized that I had been waiting my whole life to stop being alone with this story, and I was done waiting." The afternoon light through the dining room window had shifted while she'd been speaking, moving from the bright directness of midday to the softer, more amber quality of late afternoon. The magnolia tree stood still now, its blossoms a deep and luminous white against the Georgia sky. Ellie thought about Ida, who had buried herself to survive. She thought about Ruth, who had buried the truth to protect her children and had lost something essential in the burying. She thought about James, with his serious eyes and his careful hands, teaching children in a Chicago classroom, building a life she had not been part of. She thought about Clara, 61 years old in Atlanta, carrying the particular loneliness of the adopted child, who has always known there is a story about herself that no one will tell her. She thought about Josephine, 16 years old, her great-granddaughter, a girl born into a different Georgia, a different country, a world so changed from the one Ellie had grown up in that it was almost unrecognizable, and yet connected to that world by blood and by the long chain of silences that blood had been forced to carry. She was going to break that chain. She was going to sit across a table from her daughter in 2 weeks and hand her the story that had always belonged to her, and she was going to do it without protection or reservation, without the careful calibration of how much truth was safe to tell. It was 60 years late. She knew that. She was not going to pretend otherwise, was not going to dress up what she had done in language softer than the truth deserved. She had been young and she had been afraid, and the world had been brutal in ways that were real and documented and not excuses. They were simply facts. The facts of a time and place that had demanded terrible things of ordinary people. But she had also, in the end, chosen silence when she might have chosen differently. That was her truth, too. She would carry it into that restaurant in Atlanta and lay it on the table along with everything else. What Clara did with it was not hers to determine. That evening, after the guests had gone and Robert had lingered to help wash dishes, and then finally, reluctantly, kissed her forehead and driven away, Ellie sat on the back porch in the blue dusk with a glass of sweet tea cooling in her spotted hands, and looked at the magnolia tree. It was older than she was. It had stood in this yard through things she would never fully know, through the years when this part of Georgia had been something almost unimaginably different, through decades of change and resistance and change again, through all the ordinary and extraordinary days of all the lives that had moved through this property. It had bloomed every spring, without being asked to, and without explaining itself. She thought, I am still here. After all of it, I am still here. She thought, 2 weeks from Saturday. She thought about what she would say when she first saw Clara's face. James's eyes looking back at her from across a restaurant table in Atlanta, 61 years older than the last time she had seen them. She had rehearsed it in 100 different ways over the past 3 weeks. Every version she tried seemed either too formal or too sentimental, too much or not enough. In the end, she thought she would probably not say anything prepared at all. She thought she would probably just look at her daughter and let the 60 years of silence speak for themselves for one moment, and then begin the long and necessary work of filling in the space that silence had left. There was a mockingbird somewhere in the magnolia tree, running through its repertoire in the gathering dark. It could sound like almost anything. A jay, a cardinal, a car alarm 2 streets over. It was the most Georgia of birds, Ellie had always thought. Beautiful, adaptive, and constitutionally incapable of being only one thing. She listened to it until the sky went dark. Then she went inside, set her glass in the sink, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Lighter, for the first time in 60 years, than she had been when she woke up.